Do you want to see how to create files and folders with specific permissions in Windows 10? Stay tuned! Open up your File Explorer and navigate to the folder that you want to create your new files and/or folders in. Creating folders in Windows is easy. Let's get started creating a folder with default permissions as inherited from its parent folder. Right-click anywhere within this blank File Explorer area and select New, followed by Folder from the context menus. Now name this folder Default Permissions Folder. So we just create a Windows folder and name this folder Default Permissions Folder. Next, let us create a new text file within our new folder. For this, double-click Default Permissions Folder to open this folder. Creating plain text files in Windows is just as easy as creating folders. Right-click anywhere within this blank File Explorer area and select New, followed by Text Document from the context menus. Now name this file Default Permissions Textfile.txt. We have now created a plain text file named Default Permissions Textfile.txt with inherited default permissions. We can limit access to files and folders by applying permissions. Windows 10 uses NTFS as the standard file system, and NTFS offers comprehensive security capabilities and allows setting a number of different types of access permissions for files and folders. ACLs, or access control lists, are used to assign file and folder permissions. We'll be using the DACL type of ACLs to manage our access permissions. The read permission allows reading the contents of a file. In the directory context, it allows reading files and directories in that directory. The read and execute permission allows all read access and allows to run executable files. The list folder contents permission, this is the alias for read and execute in the directory context, and it allows reading and executing files in that directory. The write permission allows writing to a file or changing the file contents. Note that you may have write access without read access. In the directory context, the write permission allows to create subdirectories and write to files in that and in these subdirectories. The modify permission combines the read, execute and write permissions in one. Full control permission includes all modify permissions plus the ability to take ownership and changing the object's ACLs. By the way, files and directories are examples of commonly known objects in Windows. As this permission option suggests, full control allows users or groups to do anything they wish to these objects. Special permissions allows the configuration of any permissions beyond the normal permissions. File and folder permissions in Windows are quite complicated and we need to look at them in more detail at a later stage. For now, we'll focus on a few basic concepts of managing permissions. Okay, we will start by looking at the permissions of our default permissions text file. Right-click the file to open up the context menu. Select Properties to open the Properties dialog for our file. Now select the Security tab to view the currently applied permissions by group and usernames. There are currently 4 groups listed. We select Authenticated Users and can observe that Modify, Read and Execute, Read and Write permissions are applied for this group. Authenticated users are the users that access the systems with a username and password. Select Systems and observe that full control, modify, read and execute, read and write permissions are applied for this group. Now select Administrator and observe that these permissions are the same as the system permissions. Full control, modify, read and execute, read and write. Finally, select Users and observe that only the read and execute, read and write permissions are applied. This group has the most restrictive permissions applied by default inheritance. Note that these selections are grayed out as all these permissions are inherited from the parent folder. Click the Advanced button to view the owner of our file. This is the account under which the file was created. The owner is allowed to change permissions for other users and groups. Click Cancel and cancel again to close all dialog boxes. We will continue on creating bespoke or explicit permissions, for example read-only access permissions for files and folders. Beside the default permissions folder, we'll create a new folder and name it Read-Only Access Folder. To do so, right-click within this blank area, New, Folder, and enter Read-Only Access Folder. Now we create a new plain text file in this new folder and name it Read-Only Access Text File.txt. Double-click the new folder, right-click within this blank area, New, Text Document, and enter Read-Only Text File. Now view the Security tab from the Files Properties dialog box. Right-click the file, Properties, Security. This new file inherits the permissions from its parent folder, which are the same as the default permission text file permissions that we observed earlier. Note the grayed out check marks for modify, read and execute, read and write permissions that are applied for the authenticated users group. We will need to remove these inherited permissions before we are allowed to reapply only the read permissions. Click the Advanced button to open the Advanced Security Settings dialog. Now click the Disable Inheritance button. The new dialog box gives you two options to disable or block inheritance for our file. The first option converts the inherited permissions into explicit permissions, and the second option removes all inherited permissions. We select the first option for this exercise. This allows us to modify the newly converted explicit permissions. Click Apply. Click OK to return to the Security tab. Note that the previously grayed out check marks are no longer grayed out. Now click Edit to open the Permissions dialog. Select Authenticated Users and deselect the check marks for Modify, Read and Execute, and Write. Select Users and deselect the check mark for Read and Execute. Click Apply. Click OK to return to the Security tab. Observe the explicit permissions that we have set for our file. Note also that we intentionally retained the full control permissions for the system and administrators group. Click OK to close the Properties dialog. Open our file, add some content, and try saving it. Notepad will offer us the Save As option. And when we select the same file name to overwrite the existing file, we'll get a warning that we do not have permissions to open this file for writing, and we will need to see the file owner or an administrator to obtain permissions. Now we navigate up to modify the permissions of our read-only access folder. Right-click the folder, Properties, Security. Click the Advanced button, click the Disable Inheritance button, and select the first option that will convert the inherited permissions into explicit permissions. Click Apply, click OK to return to the Security tab. Note that the previously grayed out check marks are no longer grayed out. Click Edit, select Authenticated Users and deselect the check marks for Modify, Read and Execute, and Write. Select Users and deselect the check mark for Read and Execute. Click Apply and click OK to return to the Security tab. Again, observe the explicit permissions that we have set for our file. Note that as previously, we retained the full control permissions for the System and Administrators group. Click OK to close the Properties dialog. Double-click the folder, right-click within this blank area, select New, and observe that administrators have now only one option, and this option is to create a new folder. So far we have created a couple of files and folders, we viewed permissions and disabled permissions inheritance, and we modified group permissions. In the next exercise we will add permissions for an individual user. In preparation for this, I have created a new folder named Single User Access folder, and within this folder a plain text file named Single User Access textfile.txt. As previously, we start modifying the permissions for the text file. Right-click the file, Properties, Security tab. Click Edit to open the Permissions dialog. Click Add to open the Select Users or Groups dialog. This dialog box allows us to search for a username or group name and allows us to add this object to the list of groups and users. I enter the username mcradmin. This is the user that I want to allow full access to this file, and click Check Names. If the user is found, the full username will be displayed underlined. This user can be any user of the system. In our case, the user happens to be the owner of the file. Click OK to add the found user to the list of groups and users. Select the freshly added user and set the check mark for Full Control. Observe how all other unset check marks are automatically being set for this user. Click Apply. Click OK to return to the Security tab. Click the Advanced button to open the Advanced Security Settings dialog. Now click the Disable Inheritance button. For this exercise, we select the second option. This removes all inherited permissions. Click Apply. Click OK to return to the Security tab. mcradmin is now the only user listed in the group or usernames list and has full control over our file. Click OK to close the file's Properties dialog. Next, we navigate up to modify the permissions of our Single User Access folder. Right-click the folder, Properties, Security, click Edit to open the Permissions dialog, and click Add to open the Select Users or Groups dialog. Again, I enter mcradmin and click Check Names. The user is found and we click OK to add this user to the list of groups and users. Select the freshly added user and set the check mark for Full Control. Again, observe how all other unset check marks are automatically being set for this user. Click Apply. Click OK to return to the Security tab. Click the Advanced button. Click the Disable Inheritance button. Select the second option to remove all inherited permissions. Click Apply. Click OK to return to the Security tab. mcradmin is now the only user listed in the group or usernames list and has full control over this folder. Click OK to close the folder's properties dialog. Question: changing the parent folder to a single user access permission. Would we have to modify the plain text file's permissions the way we've changed it to a single user access permission? Use the comments area below to discuss in the community. Up to now, we used the Windows GUI to explore permissions, and that's what we want to focus on as an introduction to permissions. However, I want to show you a CLI tool that allows us to view all the discretionary access control list entries with one command. ICACLS, also known as Improved Change Access Control List Windows command, followed by a file name or directory name, will return such output. ICACLS is a powerful command line utility for managing permissions, and we use it here in its most simple way. Let's use ICACLS to view the permissions of the files and folders that we've created. Hold the Windows key and press R to open the Run dialog, and a CMD to launch the command prompt. Now navigate to the folder that we have used for our exercises. In this case, I enter cd c:\mcr to change the directory to the mcr folder. Now we key in ICACLS default permissions folder. Note that we need to enclose the folder name in double quotes, as the folder's name includes space characters. Press enter and observe the command's returned output. We can see full object names of our groups and inheritance rights and permissions. For the default permission folder, we have the administrator group with I for permissions inherited from parent container, OI for object inherit, e.g. newly created files inside this directory will inherit this folder's permissions, CI for container inherit, e.g. newly created folders inside this folder will inherit this folder's permissions, and F for full control. The system enjoys the exact same permissions as the administrators group. The users group with I for permissions inherited from parent container, OI for object inherit, CI for container inherit, and RX for read and execute. There are two lines for the authenticated user group with I for permissions inherited from parent container, OI for object inherit, CI for container inherit, IO for inherit only, and M for modify. The first line applies the modify permissions to this folder, and the second line with IO applies only to inherited subdirectories. We move on to inspect the permissions for the default permissions text file. Key in ICACLS default permissions folder / default permissions text file.txt. The administrators group and systems with I for permissions inherited from parent container, and F for full control. The users group with I for permissions inherited from parent container, and RX for read and execute. The authenticated users group with I for permissions inherited from parent container, and M for modify. Key in ICACLS read-only access folder to view the read-only access folder permissions. We have two lines for the authenticated users group. CIRX applies the list folder contents permission, and OICIR applies the read permission. The same permissions are also applied for the users group. The administrators group and system enjoys OICIF for full control permissions. Key in ICACLS read-only access folder read-only text file .txt. We can easily see that system and administrator have full control and authenticated users and users read permissions only. Finally, key in ICACLS single user access folder and note one single user with OICIF for full control permission. And last but not least, key in ICACLS single user access folder / single user access text file.txt. Note one single user with F for full control permissions. You may find it easier to use the GUI properties dialog to view file and folder permissions. However, with a bit of practice, you can inspect all permissions with the CLI's ICACLS applying one command only. In this video, we covered creating files and folders using the context menu, viewing permissions using the security tab from the properties dialog, viewing inheritance using the advanced security settings dialog, managing permissions using the permissions dialog, disabling inheritance using the advanced security settings dialog, managing user permissions using the permissions dialog and select users or group dialog, and viewing permissions and inheritance using the CLI ICACLS command.